Do you believe in curses? In Western society, hearing the name Salem likely conjures thoughts of the plague of witches who stalked New England in the 17th century, or at least the mad hunt for such creatures. But the truth of what was happening in Salem was far more nefarious than magic. The craze began in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris when his daughter Betty and niece Abigail began experiencing convulsions, uncontrollable screaming, and shaking. But it was after a local doctor attributed these fits to the supernatural that the town began its descent into chaos. The problem was, the utter mayhem of the witch trials was designed to be a distraction. But a distraction from what? Parris resided in Salem Village, where he served as the reverend at the local church. He was relatively rigid, which aligned well with the Puritans in the village, but his congregation also included those from other areas of Salem, places like Salem Town and Salem Farms, who did not all share his strict beliefs, making his position there somewhat insecure. Members of the village church had ousted 3 ministers in only 16 years, and it seems as though there were talks of forcing Parris out almost as soon as he took over. As such, there was a bit of a struggle between him and much of his congregation, which led to his salary being suspended for some months. Then, in January, when his household had little money or firewood, the 2 girls under his care began to experience these odd fits. The accusations began with fairly lowly members of society. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar woman, Sarah Osborne, another impoverished woman, and Tituba, a woman of color who served as a slave in the Parris family home. But the craze spread. More young girls in Salem were being taken hostage by the whims of witches. And it's interesting, because many of the girls happened to be from Salem Village, from the houses of Parris and his closest allies. And many of the accused happened to be their enemies. For example, John Putnam, a loyal supporter and friend of Parris, had been in a land dispute with the neighboring Nurse family when one of his daughters began being afflicted by these same fits. The village was shocked by the accusation against the family's matriarch, Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old pillar of the community who had long been respected for her piety and devotion. But she was taken into custody all the same. This connection rings a little bit suspicious, and it may be worth noting that a very similar incident had happened a few years earlier, the 1688 case of Goody Glover, which took place in Boston, where Samuel Parris had been staying prior to accepting the position in Salem Village. June saw the first execution carried out, and in July, when Sarah Good stood on the gallows being urged to confess her guilt, she instead declared, "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard. If you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." All the while, Samuel Parris had been giving sermons about witchcraft and devil worship, terrifying and galvanizing his congregation, and they couldn't very well oust him then. They were in the middle of a crisis. The following months saw the execution of Rebecca Nurse, as well as George Burroughs, a former reverend of Salem's parish. Over a dozen more people perished before a stop was put to the madness, and in retrospect, Sarah Good's declaration seems almost like a curse. Once the insanity ended, the town became choked by shame. Reverend Parris ended up losing his position after all. Judges and accusers repented, and Salem Village changed its name to distance itself from the tragedy. But 300 years later, we still remember the story of Salem. And importantly, we remember who the villains were. Blood on their hands, and if Sarah Good is to be believed, blood down their throats as well. This association with turmoil and violence is all at once ironic and apt when we look into the history of the name Salem. There are many sources which suggest that Salem is derived from the Hebrew word shalom, which generally means peace and is commonly used as a greeting or farewell. Now, this proposed etymology is a bit superficial, though we are on the right track. You see, Salem and shalom are indeed related, but to find out how, we need to look at a different city, one on the other side of the world. Jerusalem has been on the map well into antiquity, even into prehistory, so it shouldn't be too surprising that it has witnessed the unfolding of quite a bit of history itself. The dawning and demise of many eras, the birth of religions, the evolution of language and civilization. It has been conquered and pillaged and razed to the ground on numerous occasions, desired and desecrated and dug up again. We see the holy city appear early on in the book of Genesis. And so the story goes. When God made a covenant with Abram, the man who would become Abraham, instructing him to leave the house of his now deceased father and journey to the promised land of Canaan. After arriving, the party dispersed so that they each may have more land on which to settle. But being further away from each other allowed dangers to creep in. Abram received news that his nephew Lot had been abducted and was being held captive by warring kings of Mesopotamia, so he left on a rescue mission. On the journey back, Abram is greeted with bread and wine by King Melchizedek, who served as both sovereign and priest of a place called Salem. This Salem is generally believed to be synonymous with Jerusalem, both due to its relative location and other references within Scripture. Abram goes on to not only accept the food from Melchizedek, but he also pays him a tithe, showing appreciation and respect for him as a person of importance. This is interesting because of the king's links to gods other than the one whom Abram is serving. The name Melchizedek itself is likely a reference to a Canaanite god, meaning my king is the god Sedek, with another translation being my king is righteousness, with the Hebrew word for righteousness being closely related to the name Sedek. And this is far from the only instance of cognates intertwining the two languages, even in this short vignette. As a priest of El Elyon, the king blessed Abram. It has been suggested that this deity, El Elyon, is a reference to the supreme god of the Canaanite pantheon, but this is up for interpretation. Either way, El is also a word shared between the two cultures. In the land of Canaan, the word El could generally be translated as the word for a god, as opposed to a specific god, and this has similar corresponding terms in other Semitic languages as well. In Hebrew, we see the use of El as the word God, though in the context of the Old Testament, it is commonly used to refer to the supreme God Yahweh, often paired with other qualifiers like El Shaddai, Elohim, and many others. But there is one more example from this story that I want to discuss. It's almost baffling to think about, but there is evidence that suggests the area of what would become Jerusalem was actually occupied as far back as 1 million years ago. These were tribes of hunter-gatherers who migrated up from Africa, and though there are traces of them, it would be quite some time before a proper settlement was established there. However, archaeologists in Egypt have found pieces of broken pottery from the time of Pharaoh Sesostris III, naming a handful of Canaanite cities and marking them as enemies. It was believed that these potsherds were part of an execration ritual, a method of sympathetic magic used to curse an adversary. One of the cities named on the broken pottery is a place called Shalim. This is believed to be our earliest mention of Jerusalem, and if so, it not only suggests an established city, but gives us a good idea as to the etymology of the name as well. Rushalimim, or Yerushalimim, can be translated as founded by Shalim or city of Shalim. And if we fast forward to the 14th century BCE, we can find references to what is certainly Jerusalem in the Amarna letters, a collection of Akkadian clay tablets written in cuneiform, where we see the name Jerusalem, which likewise translates to city of Shalim or established by Shalim. This likely comes from the compounding of two Western Semitic words, Yaru, meaning to establish, and Shalim. Jerusalem became the Hebrew Yerushalim, which was translated into Greek as Jerusalem, then the Latin Jerusalem, into Old French Jerusalem, and it is believed that this is where that Y sound at the beginning of Jerusalem began to evolve into the J sound that we are more familiar with in Western languages today. But now we have a new question. If this is the city of Shalim, then who is Shalim? Well, when the day is over and the sun has set and the world gets quiet, that's Shalim. The Canaanite god of Dusk is a seemingly stoic and peaceful presence within his pantheon, which may be a possible explanation for the scarcity of his mythos. You see, Shalim, much as you might expect of a god of Dusk, is a bit of a mysterious figure. Unlike the more boisterous deities in his pantheon, mentions of him in the religion of ancient Canaan seem relatively fleeting. It could be that texts about him have been lost to time, but given his characterization within the Canaanite culture, his obscure nature seems quite fitting. But if legends are to be believed, we do have one story of Shalim, though it does little to explain who he was as a deity. One day, El, the highest of gods, saw two women down by the water, each knelt over a wash basin, raising and lowering cloth they were cleaning. One was calling for her mother, the other for her father. Struck smitten by the two women, El hurried to them, spiriting them away to his house. There, as a means of seduction, he threw his staff up in the air, striking down a bird, which he then plucked and set over hot coals, telling the women that when the bird was cooked, if they called for him as husband, then the two women would become his wives for now and ever, and if they called for him as father, then they would become his daughters for now and ever. When the food had been cooked, both of the women called for him as their husband, and just like that they were wed. El then kissed and embraced each wife, both of whom fell pregnant. One gave birth to Shahar, the ancient god of the dawn, and the other to Shalim. This story comes to us through a set of hymns carved into clay tablets. This tablet in particular, inscribed in a single column on either side, was discovered by a team of archaeologists sent to investigate after a peasant stumbled upon the remains of an ancient tomb in modern-day Syria. The story actually opens with a quick reference to the Canaanite god of death, Ma'at, being subdued. It is believed that this myth is part of a fertility ritual where death has been bound and incantations are dedicated to the fields of the goddesses Asherat and Rameh, before ultimately culminating in the creation of dawn and dusk. Seemingly, this process is repeated in order to give life to 5 more gods, though this part of the text is up for interpretation. In the mythological portion of the text, the gods are portrayed as suckling at Rameh, the goddess of war and fertility, but this is described as them having one lip to the earth and one to the heavens, and all manner of plants and animals, fish swimming, birds flying, etc. being eaten by the gods, but they cannot be satiated. El casts his children and wives into the desert, instructing them to build a sanctuary. There they lived for 7 years, hunting for their own food, until they stumbled across something referred to as the sown land, where they can be provided for by the guardian of this land. It has been suggested that this implies a kind of symbiosis between man and God. The gods provide for and allow humans to flourish, but they also depend on humans to provide for them as well. Shahar and Shalim are associated with the morning star and evening star respectively, yet in actuality this doesn't reference a star at all, but rather the planet Venus, which is visible at those times of day. It is likely that the people of ancient Canaan did not realize these quote-unquote stars were one and the same. But the name Jerusalem isn't the only place that we can find traces of the god Shalim. In fact, there seems to be evidence in the Old Testament associating the god and his twin counterpart Shahar with the Davidic Dynasty. As a former Canaanite stronghold, even after Jerusalem became a part of Israel, it would have been impossible to escape reminders of the old gods. And even though the holy city goes by many monikers in the Bible, it doesn't seem as though the city's conquering sovereign ever saw fit to give it a new name. David did not evict Shalim from his city, and in fact it seems as though he invited the god into his own house. 2 of King David's more prominent sons are given names that appear to pay homage to the Canaanite god, one being Absalom, which could be read as Father is Shalim or Father is Peace, and the other being Solomon or Shlomo, meaning belonging to Shalim. Furthermore, there looks to be a connection between Shalim and Shahar and the Davidic monarchy, with the king and queen being conflated with the twin gods respectively. There are hints of this theory in King Solomon himself, who is also known in the Bible by the name Yedidiah, which means beloved by Yah, as in the Hebrew god Yahweh. Yet he is far better remembered as King Solomon, which leads some scholars to believe that Solomon may have been a coronation name rather than a birth name, but this is just conjecture. However, if true, it would lend credence to the proposed association between the monarchy and Shalim. If this is the case, it is quite interesting because Shalim was not the supreme god figure within his pantheon. That particular crown of laurel landed on the head of his father El, which begs the question, what is it about Shalim that would cause monarchs to want to be associated with him specifically? What is his true nature? The reality is, that piece of the puzzle is still missing. Regardless, clearly the Canaanite gods were important cultural figures in this area of the world, even if many of its citizens primarily or exclusively worshipped other deities. Their significance seems to be inescapable, not only within the Canaanite languages, of which only Hebrew is spoken today, but in many Semitic languages. Coming back to the start, Salem is a perfect example of the reach of the old gods. Salem is a sibling to shalom, the Hebrew salutation meaning peace, which is a cousin to the Arabic salam, Maltese salam, Amharic salam, and Tigrinya salam. And these are just translations for some of the living languages. And likewise, these are all interpretations of the same word or concept. Shalim is actually at the root of many other words as well. Words meaning peaceful, wholeness, payment, completion, greeting, submission, and more. But the legacy of Shalim extends beyond the god of dusk. At its core, linguistically speaking, is a triconsonantal root word, shin, lamed, mem. These consonantal root words are a hallmark of Semitic languages, who, though they do have vowel sounds, they tend not to use characters to represent them the way we would in Latin or Germanic languages. Instead, they use diacritical marks or sometimes other consonants to indicate the use of a vowel sound and how that vowel should sound. Let's take shalom for example. Here we can see the triconsonantal root word shin, lamed, mem, and we'll begin reading right to left with the letter shin. In words like shalom, we will see a dot over the right side of the letter. This indicates that we are to make an sh sound, whereas if the dot were on the upper left, it would be pronounced as s. Underneath, we can find a mark that looks like a small uppercase T called a kamatz, which can signify either a long A sound as in father or an AW sound as in saw, depending on the dialect. Next is the letter lamed, which makes an L sound, and beside it is the consonant vavs. Vavs generally makes a V sound, but it can also be used to indicate O or U sounds. In this example, we see the character with a dot above it, which means that we should pronounce it as a long O sound, as in alone. Lastly, we have mem, which in this case is simply pronounced as an M sound. With a system like this, it is easy to see how consonantal root words could spawn legions of variations, purely based on what vowel sounds are placed where and to what extreme. And tracing out how these roots create different forms of words surrounding one concept is fascinating, but a bit too ambitious of a topic to endeavor upon in this episode. So we'll get back on topic. Shin lamed mem, which can ultimately be interpreted as to be complete. This feeling, this idea of completeness, of being wholly intact, came to be understood as being in good health, being at peace. And this is the conceptual thread tying together the various evolutions of the word Shalim, which either took its name or gave its name to the god Shalim, though as far as we know, he is the oldest and original root of this word. As the god of dusk, Shalim was associated with wholeness as the completion of the day, the silence of rest, and the peace that comes along with that. Naming a city for him must have felt like an act of hope. But the god of dusk did not build or gatekeep his city. It was run by man and was at the whims of man's vices. And likewise, his city in the New World faced oppressions just the same. Whether or not you believe in ancient Egyptian curses, or those shouted by a scorned woman's dying breath, it is undeniable that something dark has plagued the Salem communities. There has been a lot of blood and lives lost for these places that were intended to be peaceful. But perhaps it is something else in Shalim's long-lost lore that both called kings to him and imbued the founders of his cities with the audacity to wish upon the evening star. Thank you so much for listening. There should be a couple of supplementary shorts coming out on our YouTube channel in the next few weeks, so please subscribe and turn on notifications if you're interested in hearing more. And as always, please leave a like if you learned something, and feel free to let me know if there are any other words you would like to hear featured in an upcoming episode.